the ancient, deeply philosophical roots of Islamic theology, and we're following it all the way to modern American sociology. Think about it. We're looking at how age-old texts and intense debates about human reason crash right into the very real, super-personal journeys of people adopting a totally new faith in the modern West.
So here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, the foundations of Islam. Second, reason versus revelation. Third, the modern conversion experience. And finally, the motivations of American converts. Let's get right into it.
Now, I really want you to think about this for a second. What actually drives the journey to a brand new faith, right? It's almost never just one single thing. It's this incredibly complex mix of intellect, tradition, and honestly, often some kind of personal crisis that makes someone completely deconstruct their entire worldview just to build a new one from scratch. Keep that in the back of your mind as we dive in. Section 1. The Foundations of Islam. So the word Islam itself actually stems from the Arabic root SLM, and that root is all about peace, safety, and submission. Because of that, a Muslim is fundamentally defined as one who submits to the will of Allah. Now, at the absolute core of this submission is this concept called tawheed. This is absolutely crucial. It's the strict, completely uncompromising adherence to monotheism, the absolute belief in one God, no partners, no intermediaries, nothing. The Quran explicitly says, say, He is Allah, the One. That right there, that is the ultimate bedrock of the whole faith. And, this foundational belief doesn't just sit there as a theory. It translates directly into action through what we call the 5 pillars of Islam. These aren't just some abstract philosophical ideas. They are the core, lifelong practices that literally define a Muslim's everyday life. You've got Shahada, which is the declaration of faith, Salah, the 5 daily prayers, Zakah, giving to charity, Psalm, the fasting during Ramadan, and Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. It's a very structured, comprehensive framework for daily living. Moving right along to Section 2, Reason versus Revelation. Okay, so picture this epic intellectual clash back in early Iraq. On one side, you had the Mu'tazilites. They were basically the rationalists, and they heavily emphasized human intellect, or aql. They truly believed that we as humans have the free will and the brain power to understand God's objective justice. Basically, they felt things are intrinsically good or bad, and God commands what's good. But then, on the other side, neutrally speaking, you had the Hanbalis, the traditionalists. They emphasized literal scriptural tradition, what they called naql. They argued, hey, putting human reason on a pedestal, that distorts the perfect word of God. To them, God's laws are good simply because He revealed them. End of story. His absolute will defines justice, and our imperfect human brains really shouldn't be trying to judge that. But here is the really fascinating part. The primary text itself, the Quran, definitely does not ignore reason. In fact, it explicitly says that those who take patrons other than Allah are building something as incredibly fragile as the house of a spider. It constantly uses these everyday, highly observable parables from nature, like a delicate spider web or the behavior of a gnat or a bee, to actively challenge listeners to think critically. It's essentially commanding its audience to look at the natural world and use their own logical deduction to arrive at faith. Which brings us to Section 3, the modern conversion experience. So how does all this ancient theology translate into someone's life today? Well, we can actually map this out using Louis Rambo's 7-stage conversion model. He points out that religious conversion is pretty much never an overnight thing. It's an active, multi-stage quest. First, it starts with a person's context, their background. Then, bam, a crisis hits, some major tension or stressful life event. That triggers a quest for meaning. Eventually, they have an encounter with the new faith. That sparks active interaction, like reading up on it or going to services. Finally, they reach commitment, which is then followed by the long-term consequences of that huge choice. It's a really deep, heavily structured psychological process. All right, Section 4, Motivations of American Converts. Now, to ground all this theory in reality, let's take a trip to the Colorado Muslim Society Mosque over in Denver, Colorado. This is the actual spot where a researcher named Patrick Bowen interviewed a super diverse group of 13 converts. We're talking white, Latino, and Black Americans, men, women, people from all walks of life who somehow all found themselves navigating their way into this specific Sunni mosque. When you look at the demographics of this group, the average age of conversion was exactly 29.7 years old. And honestly, that is incredibly telling. Historically, people used to think of conversion as this teenage, adolescent rebellion kind of thing. But almost 30, that aligns perfectly with modern psychological theories. Have you heard of Erikson's concept of the moratorium? Basically, it suggests that in our complex, modern Western societies,
figuring out your unified identity just takes way longer now. People are really nailing down their life's meaning in their late 20s, not their teens.
And if we go back and map that crisis stage from Rambo's model to these folks, a massive stress factor pops up. Get this, 54% of these converts had recently moved to a totally different city right before their conversion. Over half. That is huge. It really shows how losing your traditional cultural roots or being geographically separated from your family can leave you wide open to a new faith. When you're constantly trying to readjust your life and identity in a new city, you often become an active seeker looking for a solid, reliable community.
So once they started that quest, what was the actual hook? Well, 54% of these American converts were driven primarily by spiritual motives, just that profound feeling that the religion felt right. Now, what's interesting is if you compare that to studies of European converts, like in France or Britain, those folks tend to be motivated way more by intellectual and logical appeals, kind of like that 8th century Mutazilite reason we talked about earlier. These American seekers definitely appreciated the logic and the lack of contradictions, sure, but the main pull for them was this deep spiritual resonance.
And this brings us to what I think is a totally fascinating paradox from the data. Most of the converts in this Denver study actually adopted the faith after the year 2001. Now, you'd think in an environment of increased hostility and stereotyping in the West, that wouldn't happen. But the intense post-9/11 media coverage of Islam had this completely unexpected effect. It put the word Islam in front of a much wider, sometimes less traditionally educated demographic. And that massive volume of exposure, it actually prompted a lot of spiritually curious seekers to just bypass the news entirely and go straight to the source. They started taking beginning Islam classes at their local mosque just to learn directly from actual Muslims.
Wow, okay, which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. We've journeyed all the way from the strict monotheism of Tawhid through ancient, intense philosophical debates about human intellect, right down to the personal crises and cross-country moves of Americans in Denver, Colorado. So I really want to leave you with this one provocative question. How do intellect, tradition, and personal crisis synthesize in your own search for meaning? Because whether you're looking at an ancient theology